This is Linda Watson, your host, and tonight we have with us Audrey Carey. So tonight we're going to be talking about something people have never heard anything about, and that is a group of people called the Scythians and the Parthians. Now, they were these huge superpowers during the time of Rome, but we don't know anything about them because our historians have completely left them out. But they were Rome's greatest rival because they were landlocked by the Scythians and the Parthians. Now, Rome went to war with Parthia 13 times and was never able to defeat Parthia. Although the historians today tell us that Rome was probably the most powerful war group at that time, they have completely left out the information about Scythia and Parthia. So we're going to start with Scythia first. Now, there are many proofs that they are the Israelites. Now, in a former show, we talked about how the people of Israel migrated into the area under the Black Sea. Now, some of them settled below the Black Sea in an area called Armenia, and that group became the Sumerians, and that's what the Greek people called them. They were actually named after the town of Samaria, which they had come from. Now, those two groups of people were one family. And for the longest time, when I studied these people, I would notice a pattern. I saw that what was going on is that every time Rome would come against Armenia, the people of Scythia who lived above the Black Sea would come down and join them in battle. And I saw this pattern continuing, and I did not understand why they would come down and protect the Armenians each time. But as time went on, I discovered that the people of Scythia were the same people that were in the area of Armenia. So it makes sense now that I understand the connection, but before I didn't understand the connection. Now, these people called the Sumerians actually were taken captive and brought to the city of the Medes. The Bible tells us that. And when the Assyrians began to fall, they began to move out of that kingdom, which was Assyria, into the kingdom of Urartu. Now, the kingdom of Urartu was located right next to the land of Assyria, and it was Assyria's greatest enemy. Assyria was never able to defeat the kingdom of Urartu. Now, at some other point, we're going to talk about those people. They were the descendants of Esau, but they were never able to defeat them. And ironically, the Scythians didn't have any trouble. Audrey, they just moved right on in, took over the area, captured the people of Urartu, and made that land their own.
Did they do this without the help of Rome?
Yeah, they did it without, they just were able to, they were just mighty warriors.
Wow.
We want to talk about Herodias. And Herodias is known as the father of history. That's the title the historians have given him today because he wrote so much about different tribes and their history, and he had these huge volumes and volumes of history that he wrote. And at the time that he lived, which was around basically around the 5th century or so, he actually began to write all this history that no one had written before. And he went and lived with the Scythians for a certain length of time. But he didn't actually visit them until 200 years after their captivity. So they had been in the land of Scythia for almost 200 years before he came to visit. And he began to write about them, and he began to tell about some of the things that they did that's just remarkable, because when he wrote about them, you realize that they were Torah keepers. They kept many of the teachings of the Bible. Now, Jeremiah also wrote to the Scythians, and he made a declaration to them. Audrey, would you mind reading Jeremiah 3, verse 12 for us?
Sure. It says, "Go and proclaim these words towards the north, and say, Return, thou backsliding Israel, saith the Lord, and I will not cause mine anger to fall upon you. For I am merciful, saith the Lord, and I will not keep anger forever."
Now, when he said, proclaim these words, he told Jeremiah, proclaim these words in the north. When you go and draw a line straight forward in the northern direction, you run into Scythia. Now,
an actual country that exists right now?
No, it's the Ukraine today, but it was at that time it was called Scythia, and the Persians called them the Saka people, S-A-K-A. which I think is really interesting. They were renamed themselves after Isaac. But the book of Jeremiah, we know, was written in the time of Josiah, so we know that Josiah lived somewhere around the 630 BC time frame. So we know that Jeremiah began to write his book. And by that time, the northern tribe went into captivity. So these people had been in the land of Scythia for probably 100 years before Jeremiah wrote this prophecy to them. So it's obvious that he was writing to people in the northern direction, and the people in the northern direction would have been the Scythians. So it can't be anybody else.
Mm.
Now, they were always known as backsliders, and they would serve God for a while, and then they would backslide, and that's been their history throughout, because we're definitely in backslide mode now, aren't we?
Yes.
Now, there's two specific proofs that these people are the Israelites, and I want to mention that. I'm talking about Scythia and Parthia.
Mm-hmm.
And during the time of the Messiah, he talked about the lost tribes of Israel. Can you read Matthew 10, 5 and 6 for us, Audrey?
Sure. Matthew 10 says, These 12 Jesus sent forth and commanded them, saying, Go not into the way of the Gentiles, and to any of the cities of Samaritans which enter you not. Matthew 10:6 says, But go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.
So now what does that tell us? It tells us the Messiah knew exactly where the lost tribes of Israel was, because he was sending the disciples there. And the disciples knew exactly where they were also. So they weren't lost. They were lost from our standpoint, yes, but everybody knew where they were.
Right.
I mean, the disciples knew where they were. Jesus, the Messiah, knew who they were. So obviously, they weren't exactly lost, were they?
Not at that time.
Not at that time. So there's a teaching out there that they were scattered among the nations, and then there's another teaching that says that they become absorbed into the tribe of Judah. But that's not what the Messiah is saying here at all. He mentions them as separate country that he was going to send the disciples to. Now, I want to mention also the people at that time knew where the tribes were because Josephus wrote about them. And Josephus was the historian for the Jews, and he lived during the 1st century. And he said the lost tribes of Israel right across the Euphrates River. He wrote that in Antiquities of the Jews. The people of that time knew where the Israelites were. They knew where the northern tribe was. So it's interesting that Josephus says they're across the Euphrates River. Now, the people across the Euphrates River were the Parthians, and they were a group of Scythians that had moved into the Central Asia region. That's who they were. So it's just amazing that we have all this evidence, and I've covered some of the evidence in other shows about how the Apocrypha talked about how in the book of Ezra, the people came out of the land of Israel and they went into another land. And then you had the historian named Eldad, who was a Jewish historian, and he also mentioned the same thing. He said they came out of the land of Israel, they came with their flocks, and they brought 200,000 foot soldiers with them. So we're talking about like 1 million people. And then you had the Armenian Chronicles and the Georgian Chronicles, which also mention how those people went through the Caucasus mountain range, and they went into the area of Scythia. Then you also have an inscription on the wall in the mountains of the Caucasus range that says, this is the gate of Israel. It's called Rit Israel. So, I mean, there's many, many proofs that these people went into the land of Scythia.
Wow.
I just think that's interesting. And they, at that time, were probably the most powerful people of their day.
So the people of Scythia wasn't a mixture of the Gentiles and the Israelites?
No, they actually were a distinct race and people. But in the area of Scythia, you did have some Oriental tribes, and they were called the Turanians. There was a group of people called the Turanians that were a short little Oriental people that lived in that area. But you also had another tribe called the Sarmatians, and the Sarmatians were the descendants of the tribe of Elam. which was one of the sons of Shem, if you remember from history. Now, another interesting thing is that they have pictures of these people in the Leningrad Museum, and they show them as European stock. And in fact, some of the pictures of the king show them being extremely tall. Some of them were 6'6". It's just amazing. And then on their money, they do not have Oriental features or appearance. They don't have that appearance on their money. Now, there was a Russian archaeologist, and his name is Chawason. He actually said that that the people that settled in that area were of European stock. He said there was 7,000 artifacts found. Most of them were tombstones, and they were of the Israelites. It's just incredible proof, and why the historians have left this out and refused to teach it is unbelievable to me. It's because they do not want people to make the connection to these people and know that the Bible is correct. So I think that's why they leave it out.
Yeah.
Now, we were talking about them being Torah keepers, and there is some evidence that they kept the Sabbath, although Herodias did not write anything about that. Now, the information we have on Herodias today comes from Tamara Rice. She is the authority on the Scythians, and she basically explains what some of the historians wrote at that time. She talks a lot about Herodias, but the history in Scandinavia also mentions them. They talk about this group of people called the Kimries. Now, you see the name Kimri all through history. And I think the people called the Assyrians called them the Gimris because they pronounced the K sound with a G. Mm-hmm. But the Kimris have been mentioned all through history, and those were the Israelites. We know they were. The Egyptians called them the Kimris. The Assyrians mentioned them also in their history, in their tablets that we have. They mention them as the Kimris, but the Scandinavian people mentioned them, and they said something really interesting that I want to read here. It says that they moved into the region, meaning Scandinavia, around 500 BC, and they were called the Kimris. And then they mentioned these people reckoned the beginning of the year as the 1st of March and Saturday as their Sabbath.
There you go.
So isn't that interesting?
Yeah, well, the Sabbath is a sign of God's people, the people he gave his laws to. As far as Scythia goes, if they were part of the tribes of Israel, were they part of conglomeration of the tribes, or?
Yeah, yes, they were. Basically, the northern tribes, and the tribe of Judah would join them later as the tribe of the Jutes. Okay, so they were called the tribe of the Jutes. But yeah, they were a conglomeration of many of the tribes, and they would eventually move into Germany. But they also migrated all the way up into the Scandinavian countries, and that's where you get the Nordic tribes. They call them the Nordic tribes that came down into Europe. And actually, the Angles and the Saxons were considered the Nordic tribes. The rest of the tribes were basically considered the Germanic tribes. And today, the whole group of them are considered Germanic tribes, and those are the ones that migrated into Western Europe. And I am amazed that they capture this information about them keeping the Sabbath. And it says they began their year in March.
Yes.
Which is when we began ours, right around the time of the Feast of Passover. So these guys were not only keeping the Sabbath, but they didn't eat pork.
True. Yeah.
Herodias wrote 200 years after they'd already left out of the land of Israel. And he said they didn't eat pork and they didn't allow pigs in their country. So even 200 years later, they're still keeping the laws.
Yeah.
Now, he also records that they tried to keep themselves separate from the Greeks, and he said they didn't believe in keeping the Greek customs. And he talks about how one king was named Silas, and his brother went to a Bacchus celebration, and when he came back from the Bacchus celebration, his brother, who was the king, had him killed. So, Audrey, can you tell everybody what a Bacchus celebration is?
It's people getting together to pay homage to the Greek god of wine.
Right. And also, it is Mardi Gras.
Yeah.
And they have a huge celebration or a parade for Bacchus. I forget which day that they have it. Is
Sunday,
it?
on
Yeah.
Sunday. Right
Yeah.
before Monday, which is that Lundi Gras?
Lundi Gras.
Because it's the day before Mardi Gras, which is Tuesday, which is Fat Tuesday.
Right.
But Bacchus is one of the biggest parades, if not the biggest.
Right, and that was the worship of Bacchus, and that's what they're still doing today.
Oh, definitely.
Same thing.
And they even have it's kind of funny because in modern day society they have a king, and they take one of the celebrities. You know how people seem to worship these celebrities, and they make one of these celebrities their king. Like they've had over the years, they've had Bob Hope, and you name them, they had all kind of people be the king of Bacchus.
Right. Well, it's interesting because nothing's new under the sun, right?
Nope. Same old thing.
Same old thing. And another king in the land of Parthia was called Silas, and he also killed his brother for celebrating a Greek ceremony. And so they were very serious about keeping Torah. They mentioned how in the book of Ezra about how they had not kept Torah, and they realized that the reason they were exiled from the land is that they had not kept Torah. They wanted to keep the laws and the statutes now that they've gone to the new land. So it's interesting that they were actually still doing this 200 years later.
Yeah.
And it's just unbelievable.
It's interesting you bring up the name that Herodias was talking about King Silas, how close that is to the word Saul.
Exactly.
Which was, king of Israel. And
yeah,
was it Judah? Israel.
No, it was Israel.
Yeah.
So it is interesting. Now, I'm just going to read you that quote from the book of Ezra. It says, "But they took counsel to themselves that they would leave the multitude of the heathen and go further into further country which never man dwelt, that they there might keep the statutes which they never kept in their own land." So there you go right there, that they had every intention of keeping the statutes and the laws. Mm-hmm. Now, just to describe the people of Scythia, they were a hard-working agrarian people. And all through the Bible, Abraham and his descendants were farmers, and they raised sheep and cattle, and they basically were an agrarian society. It's not that they didn't have merchants and skilled labor, they did, but they were basically an agrarian society. And Herodias wrote that just one of the cities in Scythia raised 700,000 bushels of wheat and sent to Athens to sell.
Wow.
They raised wheat. And I think that's interesting because that's one of the things we've done through the centuries. We have been a major manufacturer and exporter of wheat.
Yes.
So,
and another parallel is they were agrarian, and that's how America started out. And of course, God always used Israel as an example with the agrarian ways. But they were also a mighty army, and America became one of the mightiest nations on earth to have the best military too.
Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about casting lots, because they did something called casting lots, which is mentioned in the Bible. And they would take a willow branch and they would tie all the possible answers that they thought would come up. They'd ask a question and then they would tie all the possible answers for that question. It was like a multiple choice. And they would tie it to the branches of this willow, and then someone would pick one of the branches. That would be the decision that they would go with. So that's how they made their decisions. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really interesting because that's where we get the magic wand.
Oh, really?
And they also had a group of priests who were their judges. That particular religious class, which we call the priest class, was the Levites, but they called them the Magi. That was their name. And it's interesting because that was the group of people that Herodias talks about. They were not elected. They were not people that they elected. They were of a certain tribe. And I think that just is unbelievable proof that these people were the Israelites, because they always used the tribe of Levi as their priest.
that lineage just kept going on.
So they remember many of those things. And for years, that's how Israel made decisions, was by casting lots. So we want to talk a little bit about the Magi now, Audrey. And you know the story of the Messiah and when he was born, and how the people that were called the Magi came to the land of Israel, and they were looking for the newborn king, right?
Right.
And the story that people know today is not the real story. The
it's
Magi,
the 3 wise men.
right, they have the story of the 3 wise men. Well, actually, the truth is they didn't find the Christ child until he was almost 2 years old, and they came with a caravan of gifts. They didn't just come with the 3 gifts that are mentioned in the Bible. Those gifts were there, yes, and they are mentioned, but they came with a whole caravan, and it wasn't just 3 men. It was a actual caravan of people that came to bring these gifts to the Messiah. They knew from a star that was in the sky that he was to be born. And there was a star, a special star called the Star of Bethlehem, that showed 2 years before the Messiah was actually born, and that star was actually 2 planets. They've had articles written about that and how that was part of history. And of course, today we know nothing about it, but it was a star that people saw at that time, and they actually believed that the Messiah was coming before he actually came. Even the Greeks wrote about it.
Wow.
They said, we believe the Messiah is going to be born now because we see this double star. So it's like what we see today with the blood moons, I think.
Right. God definitely uses the heavens for like a billboard.
Exactly.
And if you do look in the Bible, it doesn't specifically say 3, does it? 3 wise men?
No, it doesn't.
It says the wise men. It's just like people misinterpret when they talk about Adam and Eve. They say she ate an apple, and it just says fruit.
Right. Exactly.
They read a lot into that.
They surely do. Now, Tacitus wrote about Scythia. Now, he was a Roman historian that lived during the 1st century. He lived at the same time as Julius Caesar, and he wrote quite a bit about the Scythians. Because remember, during that time frame from the 4th, 5th century down to the 1st century, the historians were writing a lot because there was a lot that had been destroyed and left out. So many of these historians were trying to make up for the history that had been lost and destroyed. They were creating new libraries in the area of Alexander and in Carthage at that time. But he wrote about how the Scythians were the Saxons and that they eventually were called the Germans. And the Germans would be the people that eventually, would settle into Western Europe. And they would also go and settle in England and in Britain as the Saxons and the Anglo-Saxons. Now, each week we're going to add more to this history, so you'll be able to see how the people began to migrate into areas into Western Europe. But we can't cover all of that tonight. Now, they moved all the way to the top of the Ukraine, which is Russia, and they separated themselves from the rest of the people. Now, that was God's intent. If you remember what I read in the book of Ezra, that they moved all the way up, it says, away from everyone. And their intention was to separate themselves from the rest of the people so that they would not be influenced by other pagan worship. That was their whole purpose. But we also want to mention that they did not intermarry. They did not mix. And I want to read you what Tacitus said. Like I said, he wrote during the 1st century, says that the Kimmeries were Germans, and the Germans were never to have intermarried with other nations. They kept themselves separate because they didn't want to mix with other nations and pick up their pagan beliefs and rituals. And it says, but to be a race pure, unmixed, and stamped with a distinct character. Now, that's written in his book called Tactius de Morib, and I have the actual quote on my internet page if any of you want to see that reference. And that tells you right there that these people did not mix their race. And they were a very unique specific people who wanted to keep God's laws, and that's not what we're told today, and that's probably why we're not told about them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the people today have this diversity teaching that's absolutely against the teaching of Yahweh. In every aspect, they're trying to separate families.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the chic thing to do, to send your child to a college across the country to get educated. The child goes 1,000 miles away to some Ivy League school or high-ranking university. They're separated from their family for 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
Then when they get out, they're encouraged to take a job away from their family. All these things are, I'm not saying these things are wrong, but that's not exactly what God's plan was. If you remember in the land of Israel, when they lived in the land of Israel, they actually were given family land, and it was passed down from generation to generation. And the tribes stayed together in one group, and they passed this land down, and if they sold the land for some reason, in the Jubilee year, they were required to return the land back to the original family.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is God wanted to keep the families together. He wanted the people to live and marry in their own communities if it was possible. So that what would happen, a daughter would marry and go and move with her husband's family, but she married in her own tribe, she would still be near her family.
Mm-hmm.
And that was God's intent from the very beginning, was to keep these families together. Now today, you see so many people separated, families separated all over the country, and they get together a couple of times a year, and they're like strangers.
Yeah.
And it becomes a very lonely thing for family members to be separated from their families.
Yes,
It was never God's intent.
It wreaks havoc in society too, because the family unit could take care of each other when people get elderly or sick, and they've got the family to do that, and it wouldn't be the big strain on the government.
Exactly. Now, I want to tell you that the Talmud talks about and teaches that the Israelites came back to the land of Israel and stayed, and I want to cover that. I'm just going to mention 2 Chronicles 35, verse 17 and 18, that talks about how the Israelites came back to the land of Judah. Now, I want to mention that because Herodias also talked about that time frame, and he basically said that that the Scythians had joined with the Medes. Now, they joined with the Medes and they went to battle against the Assyrians. Now, the Assyrians were already in decline. We remember that it was the Assyrians that brought these Israelites in the area of Scythia into captivity. So this was payback time. Yeah. So you had the Scythians and the Medes actually going to war against the Assyrians. Well, they didn't stop there. They went through the entire Asia Minor area, and they captured most of the lands in that area. And one of the lands they captured was the land of Israel. They took back the land of Israel. Now, Herodias talks about when they went into these lands, they just devastated everything and destroyed so much. Mm-hmm. But when they went into the land of Israel, they didn't destroy anything. They were just very peaceful, and they came in, and you could see that they didn't go in and destroy anything. So he made a comment about that, how they didn't destroy anything in the land of Israel. Well, of course they didn't, because that was their brother.
Right, right.
And it's how many more proofs do we have before people realize who their ancestors are? I mean, I've mentioned many, many, many examples. Now, what actually happened is many of the people from the tribe of Judah did join up with the Scythians, mm-hmm. and they become the tribe that we mentioned called the Jutes. And during the 4th century, we know that the Angles and the Saxons, who became the Anglo-Saxon people, came out of Germany, and they went into Britain, and they brought the Jutes with them. Mm. And the Jutes actually settled in the bottom part of Britain. And it's really interesting because the Saxons settled in Britain on the western side, and the Angles settled on Britain on the eastern side, and the Jutes settled at the bottom of Britain, which I just think is kind of interesting that they still continue to separate themselves.
True. Now, so I have a question, Linda.
Sure.
When the Scythians, when they were in the northern, up north of Israel, right?
Uh-huh.
And which is in the area of, not the Ukraine.
Yeah, in the
Yeah,
Ukraine
yeah,
area.
okay. When Assyria attacked Israel and took them captive, did they take, so because they were separate up there, they were like saved?
Well, actually, when the book of Ezra records that they left out before the land of Israel fell, they
Hmm.
saw the handwriting on the wall, and
Right.
there was millions of them, and that they went through the Caucasus mountain range. Those particular people called the Sake never went into captivity. Now there was a group that was taken. People that were on the eastern side were the people that were taken captive, but the ones on the western side of the Jordan weren't taken captive. So the ones on the eastern side were the ones that were taken into the land of Assyria
Right.
as captives. Now, eventually, when Assyria fell, those people went back up and joined their brothers and
Brothers. Right.
sisters in Scythia.
Okay.
They migrated up. Now, some of them actually migrated to Armenia, and they lived in the area of Armenia, and that's the people that you see mentioned as the Sumerians, I should say. That's what the Greeks called them, was the Sumerians,
Hmm.
which I think is really interesting. Now,
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier, though, Audrey, and you said these were a powerful military people, and we do
Right.
want to talk about that. They were a powerful military people. They were an incredible war power. They were the movers and shakers in history at that point. Now, Herodias talks about how these people were a powerful war machine, but he said even though they were very powerful warriors, he said that they treated their captives very gently,
Hmm.
and he said that they would actually take their enemies that they captured and give them land and give them wives, which I thought was really interesting. That showed a different side of them.
Hmm.
Now, the Scythians are known as being the first people to ride horses, and they created the first saddle. And Tacitus, he wrote this. He said, in respect to military strength, numbers of soldiers, not one single nation, either in Europe or Asia, could match the Scythians.
Wow.
Now, he's writing at the first century, so they are in their prime at that point.
Right.
And so, how in the world, Audrey, can these people be left out of history? There's
I,
only one reason.
yeah, they didn't want to, people didn't want to be associated with, in the Bible or with Israel.
Exactly. And so they have no intention of letting people know that information.
Hmm.
And if our people knew who their ancestors were, that they were the Israelites, then many of them would probably return back to keeping God's laws, because they could see that our people have kept these laws and kept the Bible for centuries. And
Yes.
now in our age and during our time, they're moving away from it. In fact, one major talking head on Fox Network said, well, the Bible is nice, but it's most of that is just fables and stories. He just
Yeah.
mentioned that's what
m-
they believe.
More and more people are believing that, and they're teaching that in the universities. I have my daughter's in college right now, and even in her religion class, they're saying that, I think she thinks, the teacher herself, those stories are just fables. Adam and Eve, Noah, they're just
Right.
fables.
But you can actually find those stories written in history.
Mm-mm.
So now, can you read for us Psalms 105, verse 24?
Okay. Verse 24, Psalms 105 says, and he increased his people greatly and made them stronger than their enemies.
Right. And so this was a prophecy written by David saying that they increased in size and they would be stronger than their enemies. And that is exactly what has happened here. And Abraham was told, that was one of his promises, that his descendants would become as the sands of the sea. They would increase in size, and they were mighty warriors. They
Yep.
were unbelievable warriors. So today, if the government comes in to try and take our guns away, you're going to see a lot of people try to fight to keep their guns. It's just
Right.
part of our nature. It's part of our character, and people don't know where they came from, so they don't understand that you can't change people's character like that.
Right.
Now, I want to tell you a real interesting story, and that is the story of Cyrus, the king of Persia. Now, he's mentioned in Scripture, and he
Hmm.
was the man that let the tribe of Judah return to the land of Israel and Jerusalem and rebuild it, if you remember that. Now, he wanted to take control of Scythia. So in 530 BC, he marched into Scythia. And the queen at that time, the Scythians were being ruled by a woman at that time, and her name was Tormorius. And first, he would just try to make an alliance with them, so he asked to marry her, and she refused. So next, he decided he would bait these Israelites. And so he put alcohol and food out, and after they got drunk, then he just came in and gathered them all up. So that's pretty slick. Now, Tamaris became extremely angry because one of her sons had been taken captive. She sent a message to King Cyrus, and she said, before the sun sets tomorrow, I will have your head in my hand. And she delivered that message to Cyrus, and that's exactly what happened. He was killed. His head was brought to her. She sent the head to the Sumerians. See, that also shows that the Sumerians were the same people, so she wanted to let them know that Cyrus the Great, who was probably one of the most influential leaders and rulers of his day, was killed by this Scythian queen.
Yeah.
So he was this great man, Cyrus the Great, who was killed by a female queen.
Yeah, a woman.
Well, as time goes by, we'll mention some of the stories about women in the land of Israel because they had women rulers. Now, in 586 BC, we know Nebuchadnezzar went in and attacked Jerusalem, and that's when Jerusalem fell. And at that same time frame, these people called the Sumerians, which lived, remember, underneath the Black Sea in the area of Armenia, they began to migrate into the Blue Danube area. And from that point on in history, they are called the Celtic people. Now, I know everybody's heard of the Celtic people. And so they were just now renamed in history. But they were also called the German people, and some people called them the Gauls.
Yeah.
Now, in the 6th century, the Scythians had covered way into the Eastern European area. The Rhine was the dividing line, the Vulgate. They had spread themselves into Central Asia all the way to the east, and they were almost scattered to the land of China.
That's
and then
huge, yeah.
There's this huge area. And then the Central Asia Minor area where you have Turkey and Pakistan and Afghanistan and all of those areas, that's the area that Parthia began. The Scythians began to come down and they settled in the area, in that region, then they become Parthia. Now, they didn't really go to battle with these people. They just kind of pushed their way in and took over. There was just such a huge amount of people that at that time, that area was being controlled by Greece, because you remember Alexander the Great had taken his empire and it was divided into 4 regions. And the part called the Seleucid Empire was that Asia Minor area and Greece. And all of that area was controlled by the king of Greece. Now, it's interesting that that's the area that we call Parthia today. And they really were the Scythians that just pushed their way into that area and just basically took over. They didn't really, there wasn't that many battles involved in taking the land. They just kind of pushed their way in. It's just interesting.
Yeah, they're as large as any empire ever was, it seems.
Right, and there's a reason that they pushed themselves all the way to China. This is not a good story. We're the first people to bring pot into Europe. Herodias made reference to that. They would use it as sauna baths, and they also, after a funeral, they would feel hot in a tent. After a battle, they would do the same thing. So it's been our practice. Now, even when I was in school, I remember the teacher telling us that they had a hemp plant in this country. The crop was almost as large as cotton in this country. It's amazing how much of our history has been deliberately left out.
Yeah.
Now, this area that they moved in above the Black Sea, they called that area Sareth. And Sareth was also a river that's still there today in the Ukraine. It's in the northwestern region. It's called Sareth. And it's interesting because that is a Hebrew word. Now, let's talk about that a second. Audrey, would you mind reading Deuteronomy 29:28 for me?
Okay. And Deuteronomy 29:28 says, "And the Lord rooted them out of their land in anger and in wrath and in great indignation and cast them into another land. And it is this day," or as it is this day.
And it's interesting, the word for another land is a Sareth. It's the same word. They use the same word. And so what they did is when they went up to the land of Scythia, they named their country another land, which I think is interesting. And that's what the river was called, another land.
And is it still it's named right that?
The river is still named that today, yeah. So that's why they called it a Sareth, because they understood that they were cast out of their original land, which was the land of Israel, into another land. Now, can you read 2 Samuel 7, verse 10 for me?
Sure. It says, "Moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in the place of their own, and move no more. Neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them any more as before time."
Okay. Now, this was written by David, and he's telling the people that, he said, "Moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them, that they will dwell in a place of their own and move no more." Now, I want to make some comments about that, because he wasn't talking about the land of Israel there. They were already there. He's talking about moving them to a different land. And we know that every stop they made, there was a group of them that would settle and put down roots. They became Israel's nations. They are scattered into Australia, New Zealand, East and West Europe, Britain, Scandinavian countries, Iceland, Scotland, and many others. And they're still there today. Now, can you read Joshua 1, verse 3 for me?
Sure. "Every place that the sole of your foot shall tread upon, that have I given unto you, as I said unto Moses."
Exactly. And so what has happened here is our people did scatter, and they scattered everywhere. But we also want to mention the fact that the Scythians and the Parthians were moved out of these areas, and first Parthia fell, and they moved into the area where the Scythians were, and then eventually the Huns came in and pushed the Scythians out of that area. By the 1st and 2nd century, they were moving into Germany, and then they began to move into Europe. During that time frame, they never went into captivity. Now, they were pushed out, they were defeated in battles, but they were never brought back into captivity. And the books of the prophets talk about a time frame in the future where our nation, which are the Israelites and many of the other Israelite nations, will eventually go back into captivity.
Yeah.
It says you will return again into captivity. Now, I mentioned earlier that the nation of Parthia, and that it had gone to war with Rome 13 times. Now, why did they go to war is the question. And they went to war because Rome, during that time frame, was landlocked. Rome couldn't expand in any direction, because in the northern area where the Scythians, they couldn't expand there. In the southern part, you had the Parthians in Central Asia, so they couldn't expand there. The Mediterranean Sea was locked down because the Carthaginians had control of the Mediterranean Sea. So really Rome was not able to expand. They were landlocked. And so that's why they went to war with Parthia 13 times, because they were trying to push their way eastward.
Yeah.
And they were never, ever able to defeat the Parthians. At the time right before the Messiah, Parthia had pushed their territory into the Middle East and had taken over the land of Israel. And at that point, that was when the famous Mark Antony came in and pushed them back across the Euphrates River. So the Euphrates River was a boundary for the area of Scythia and Parthia. Northern Africa was controlled by Rome, and the Euphrates River was the dividing line. And it's just...
So that would be from the tribe of Judah, huh?
Exactly. They were from the tribe of Judah. Now, also, a lot of the towns in Parthia had names from the old Israelite country. They had Gaza. They had Samaria. It's interesting the carryover, they had the city of Dara, of Asac. They were all Israelite names. And two of the tribes, the smaller tribes in Parthia, divisions, one of them was called Bactra. And Bactra, it was one of the sons, we know, of Ephraim. If you read Numbers 26, 35, and 36, that was one of Ephraim's sons. So there's just so many proofs that these people were the Israelites. So I hope that after we've gone through this information that everybody has a better understanding of who these people were and see the proof of how they were Torah keepers and they were the descendants of the Israelites. So Audrey, do you have any final comments?
No, but I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the story because how Parthia comes into play and a lot of the history there, it really is intriguing, and it's just amazing how much history we don't know.
So now, everyone, we want to close now and going to say good night.
Good night.